In the quiet gardens of an ancient palace, beneath silk banners that moved gently in the warm air, a young prince lived a life designed to keep suffering far away. The gardens were always in bloom. The food was always abundant. The music that drifted through the corridors was always soft and pleasing. The people around him were young, healthy, and carefully chosen. Nothing old, nothing broken, nothing painful was permitted to pass through the palace gates. His name was Siddhartha, and everything about his life had been arranged with great love and great care so that he would never have to ask the questions that would one day change the world. Welcome to First Beliefs. Tonight, we follow a story that has been told and retold across 2,500 years, a story that is not at its heart about religion or doctrine or the founding of an institution. It is a story about a human being who looked honestly at the fact of suffering and who refused to look away. It is the story of Gautama Buddha, the prince who walked away from everything in search of something he could not yet name. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel more than you may think. The Palace and the Promise. The story begins, according to early Buddhist tradition, in the foothills of what is now the border region between Nepal and northern India, in a small but prosperous kingdom called Shakya. The ruler of this kingdom was a man named Suddhodana, and he loved his son with the particular fierceness of a parent who has already known loss. Siddhartha's mother, Queen Maya, had died shortly after giving birth, and the child had been raised in the palace with a tenderness shaded by grief. When Siddhartha was very young, tradition tells us, a wandering seer came to the palace and looked at the infant with great attention. He made a pronouncement that Suddhodana would carry with him for the rest of his days. The child, the seer said, was marked for one of two destinies. If he remained in the world, if he ruled, if he governed, if he took up the life of a king, he would become a great and powerful leader, a unifier of peoples. But if he ever encountered the deeper truths of human suffering, he would turn away from the world entirely. He would become instead something rarer and more lasting than a king. He would become a fully awakened being. Suddhodana heard both destinies and chose, as any loving father might, the one that kept his son close. He chose the palace, and so the arrangements began. The gardens were maintained in perpetual beauty. The palace staff was selected for their youth and health. Anything that might suggest the fragility of life sickness, old age, poverty, grief, was kept far beyond the walls. Siddhartha grew up in a world that was, in the most literal sense, curated. Every sight, every sound, every taste had been considered. He was educated, accomplished, and at ease. He married a woman of grace and kindness named Yasodhara, and in time they had a son together, whom they named Rahula, a word that carries a meaning, something like bond or fetter, a name that would take on its own kind of significance as the story unfolded. By all outward measures, Siddhartha was a fortunate man. He was healthy and thoughtful, surrounded by beauty and affection, positioned to inherit a kingdom. And yet, according to early tradition, something in him was restless, not unhappy in any sharp or urgent way. More like a quiet uncertainty, the feeling, perhaps, that the world as it had been presented to him was somehow incomplete, that there were rooms in the palace of existence that he had not yet been allowed to enter. He could not have known in those early years what was waiting for him beyond the gates. The Four Sides. It is one of the most quietly powerful sequences in all of the world's spiritual literature. not a battle, not a miracle. Just a man riding through a city, seeing things that are simply there, things that have always been there in every city, in every age, and being unable this time to look past them. Early Buddhist accounts describe Siddhartha making several journeys outside the palace in his young adulthood. His father arranged these trips carefully, clearing the roads of anything that might disturb the prince. But on one occasion, or perhaps across several, the accounts vary gently in their detail. The arrangements did not hold, and Siddhartha saw. The first sight was an elderly man, bent, slow, his body carrying the long weight of years. Siddhartha, who had grown up among only the young and vigorous, asked his charioteer what he was seeing. The charioteer explained simply, "This was old age. This is what becomes of the body over time. This is what awaits every living being who is given enough years." Tradition describes Siddhartha returning to the palace in silence. On a subsequent journey, he encountered a person who was gravely ill, the body in pain, the face hollowed by suffering. Again he asked. Again the charioteer explained, "This is illness. This too is part of life. The body is not permanent. It breaks. It suffers." The prince returned again in silence. Then came a funeral procession, a body being carried to cremation, mourners walking alongside in grief. Siddhartha watched and understood, perhaps for the first time in a way that moved through his whole being rather than merely his intellect, that every living thing dies, that he himself would die, that everyone he loved would die, that the palace walls had never been protection from this, only a postponement of knowing it. These three encounters are sometimes described as the three messengers. They were not unusual sights. They were simply life, seen clearly. But for a man who had been shielded from them, they arrived with the quiet force of revelation. And then came the fourth sight. Amid all of this, amid the grief and the illness and the presence of death, Siddhartha saw a wandering ascetic, a man who had given up home, possessions, and social position to walk through the world in search of understanding. The man was thin and simply dressed, carrying almost nothing. And yet, according to tradition, his face was calm. Not the performed calm of someone suppressing feeling, but something quieter, the stillness of a person who had made peace with the nature of things and was walking with full attention toward something beyond them. Siddhartha looked at this fourth sight for a long time. He returned to the palace, but something had shifted. The silk banners still moved in the warm air. The gardens were still in bloom. The music was still soft, and none of it, not a single carefully arranged element of the beautiful life his father had built for him, felt like an answer to what he had now seen. The questions had arrived, and they would not leave. The night of leaving and the years of seeking. What happened next is described in early tradition with a quality of great stillness rather than high drama. There was no announced departure, no confrontation, no speech. Siddhartha simply waited until the deep of night, when the palace was quiet and his wife and young son were sleeping, and he walked to the stables. He mounted a horse. His groom, a faithful servant named Channa, accompanied him. And together they rode out through the palace gates and into the dark. Early accounts note that Siddhartha paused at the gate and looked back. He looked at the palace, at the world his father had built for him, at the life that was, in every conventional sense, a good life. He looked for a long time, and then he turned and rode on. He traveled through the night until he reached the edge of the kingdom. There, at the boundary of the land that had been his home, he removed his fine clothes and his jewelry and gave them to Channa to carry back. He cut his own hair, the long, carefully dressed hair of a prince, with his own sword. And he sent the horse and the servant back, and stood alone at the edge of the forest with nothing. He was, according to tradition, around 29 years of age. What followed was several years of serious and arduous seeking. Siddhartha did not wander aimlessly. He sought out teachers, the most respected spiritual guides of his time and region, and he studied with them with full dedication. He learned the practices of deep meditation and inner absorption that were taught in the contemplative traditions of the day. He went as far into these practices as his teachers could take him, and then further still. And yet, by his own account, as preserved in early Buddhist texts, something remained unresolved. The practices brought states of great stillness and clarity, but they did not answer the question that had begun in those moments outside the palace gates. They did not reach all the way to the root of suffering. So he turned to another path that was highly respected in the spiritual culture of ancient India, the path of extreme physical asceticism. The practice of denying the body, of subjecting it to hardship and privation, was understood by many seekers of the time as a way of purifying the spirit. If desire and attachment were the roots of suffering, then eliminating desire through the disciplining of the body might lead to freedom. Siddhartha pursued this path with the same wholehearted intensity he had brought to his meditation practice. He ate almost nothing. He exposed himself to heat and cold. He pushed his body to its very limits. A small group of fellow ascetics, recognizing his dedication, joined him and practiced alongside him. For years this continued. And then, tradition tells us, something happened that seemed small at the time, but carried within it the seed of everything that would follow. A young woman from a nearby village, seeing the emaciated ascetic sitting beneath a tree, offered him a simple bowl of rice and milk. And Siddhartha, in a moment of quiet clarity that he could not entirely explain, accepted it. His companions were shocked. They believed he had abandoned the path, fallen back into desire and comfort. They left him, and Siddhartha sat alone, strengthened slightly by the food he had eaten, and turned his attention inward once more. But now with something new, a recognition arrived at through experience rather than instruction, that the path of extreme denial was not the answer any more than the path of extreme comfort had been. That somewhere between the palace and the ascetic's forest, somewhere between indulgence and self-punishment, there was another way. A way that he had not yet fully found, but that he could now sense, the way you sense a presence in a room before you have turned to look at it. He rose, walked to the bank of a river, and bathed. He accepted more food, and then he walked, slowly and with great deliberateness, to a place beneath a large and spreading tree. He sat down. Beneath the Bodhi tree. The tree was a fig tree of the species that would later be named the Bodhi tree from the Sanskrit word for awakening. It stood in a place called Bodh Gaya in what is now the northeastern Indian state of Bihar. Siddhartha sat beneath it in the early evening and settled into meditation. According to early Buddhist tradition, he made a quiet resolution. He would not rise from this place until he had understood what he had been seeking. Not until the question that had been alive in him since those first moments outside the palace had found its answer. The night passed around him. Allow yourself, for a moment, to rest in this image. A man sitting very still beneath a large tree. The night sky above, familiar and vast. The sounds of the natural world insects, wind in the leaves, the distant movement of water. His breath, rising and falling. His attention, gathered and steady. Early tradition describes various forces of distraction arising in this long night of meditation, forces that the Buddhist texts name and personify in the figure of Mara, a kind of symbolic representative of the pull toward comfort, toward fear, toward all the ordinary movements of the mind that keep awareness from reaching its deepest ground. Desires arose, doubts arose. The ordinary restlessness of an untethered mind moved through him like weather. And yet, tradition tells us he remained still, not by force, not by suppression, but by a quality of steady, open attention that let each movement arise and pass without grasping and without resistance. The night deepened. The stars turned slowly overhead. The trees' leaves moved very slightly in whatever air was moving. And then, in the time before dawn, in that still, uncertain space between the deepest dark and the first gray light, something opened. Early Buddhist accounts approach this moment with great care and with a certain reverence for what is ultimately beyond easy description. What Siddhartha is said to have experienced is not a vision of a deity, not a message delivered from outside. It is described more as a direct and complete seeing, a recognition of the nature of things that was total and transforming. The causes of suffering became clear. The nature of the mind became clear. The possibility of freedom became clear. He did not become someone else in that moment, tradition suggests. He did not receive special powers or divine authority. He saw deeply, completely, without any remaining corner of confusion. He understood, and with that understanding, the accounts tell us something that had been turning for a very long time. The cycle of seeking, the restlessness, the not yet arrived quality that had followed him from the palace to the forest, to the river bank, to this tree, settled at last into stillness. The sun rose. It was an ordinary sunrise. The world was exactly as it had been the night before. And yet, for the man sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, breathing in the morning air, everything had changed. Not because the world had changed, but because the seeing had changed. The nature of things had been met directly, without the screen of habit or confusion. He sat for several more days, simply resting in that understanding. And then, slowly, he began to consider what to do next. He had walked away from one life. Now, it seems, a new one was quietly beginning. The teaching that began in a deer park. There is a gentle irony in what happened next. The man who had left his princely life to seek understanding now found himself with something to offer and the question of whether to offer it. Early tradition holds that Siddhartha, now understood by his followers as the Buddha, the awakened one, spent some time in quiet reflection after his experience beneath the Bodhi tree. What he had understood felt, in some sense, difficult to communicate. It was not a set of facts or rules. It was more like a direct perception, the kind of thing that can be pointed toward but not simply handed over. He is described as wondering whether there were others who might be capable of understanding, whose eyes, as the early texts put it beautifully, were only lightly covered with dust. He decided to try. He made his way to a deer park near the city of Varanasi, a city that sat, as it still does today, on the banks of the Ganges River. And there he found the 5 ascetics who had previously been his companions and had left him when he accepted the bowl of food. They saw him coming and were inclined initially to ignore him. They had decided he had abandoned the serious path of seeking. But as he drew closer, something in the quality of his presence gave them pause. They welcomed him. They sat together in the deer park, and the Buddha began for the first time to teach. What he shared that day, according to early Buddhist tradition, has been preserved in texts known as sutras, recorded teachings that were passed down through communities of monastics and later committed to writing across the centuries. What he offered was not a theology, not a cosmology, not a set of rules imposed from above. It was more like a careful and compassionate description of what he had come to understand about the nature of suffering and the possibility of freedom from it. At the center of this teaching were what followers came to know as the Four Noble Truths. The first truth is sometimes translated simply as suffering, or the existence of suffering. The early teaching acknowledged plainly that life, as it is ordinarily experienced, contains suffering. Not all of it, and not always, but it is genuinely present. The body ages, it grows ill, it dies. The things we love change or disappear. The things we want are not always available. The things we wish to avoid arrive anyway. This is not presented as a pessimistic view of existence. It is offered as an honest one, a clear-eyed acknowledgement of something that every human being already knows but often moves very quickly past. The second truth concerns the origin of this suffering. Early teaching suggests that what drives the recurring experience of unsatisfactoriness, what keeps the wheel of difficulty turning, is a particular quality of clinging. A reaching after pleasure, a flinching away from pain, a grip on things as we wish them to be, rather than an open meeting with things as they actually are. The word used in early Buddhist texts is often translated as craving or thirst, a restless, driven quality of wanting that, because it is never quite satisfied, perpetuates itself. The third truth offers something that the first two might not immediately suggest. It offers a possibility. The teaching holds that the condition described is not permanent, that the clinging, the craving, the reactive patterns of mind, these can be seen through and over time released. The freedom that the Buddha had touched beneath the Bodhi tree was not his alone, not a miracle reserved for a single exceptional life. It was a possibility available to any being willing to look with honesty and to practice with patience. The fourth truth points toward the path. It suggests that there is a way of living and practicing that gradually shifts the quality of awareness, loosens the grip of habitual reactivity, and opens the space in which genuine freedom becomes possible. This path, early Buddhism, describes as the Eightfold Path, 8 dimensions of practice and orientation, that together constitute what the tradition calls the middle way. The middle way. This phrase deserves a moment of quiet attention. It refers at one level to the path between extreme self-indulgence and extreme self-denial, the two approaches Siddhartha had tried in his palace life and his ascetic years and found incomplete. But at a deeper level, it points towards something more subtle, a quality of balance, of clear seeing, of neither grasping nor pushing away, that runs through every dimension of a life oriented toward understanding. The 8 aspects of this path, as described in early teaching, are often grouped into 3 areas of practice: wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental cultivation. The wisdom aspects concern the quality of understanding and intention one brings to life, seeing clearly, moving from intentions that are rooted in care rather than confusion. The ethical aspects concern the ways one engages with others, and the world, speaking with honesty and kindness. acting in ways that do not cause unnecessary harm, living in a way that is sustainable and genuine. The mental cultivation aspects concern the training of attention itself, the practice of gathering awareness into steadiness and clarity, the gradual deepening of the quality of presence one brings to each moment of experience. These 8 dimensions are not commandments from outside. They are more like facets of a single orientation, the orientation of a person who is genuinely interested in understanding the nature of their own mind and genuinely committed to causing as little harm as possible while moving through the world. Followers who gathered around the Buddha in the years following that first teaching in the deer park found in these ideas something that spoke to their own experience of existence, not a new mythology, not a new set of supernatural promises, but a clear and compassionate map of the mind, a description of why life so often feels unsatisfying, and a gentle, practical suggestion of how that dissatisfaction might, with patience and honest effort, be met and understood, and gradually released. Communities formed, monasteries were established. People from many different backgrounds and circumstances, from different castes, different regions, different life histories, found their way to these teachings and took up the practice of the path. The tradition held from its very beginning a quality of openness that was notable for its time. What mattered, early Buddhism suggested, was not where one had come from, but the quality of attention and intention one brought to the inquiry. The Buddha is said to have taught for around 45 years following that morning in the deer park. He walked through the towns and forests of northeastern India, speaking with farmers and merchants, with scholars and kings, with those who were suffering and those who were simply curious. He did not demand belief. Early texts preserve a teaching in which he encouraged his listeners not to accept anything simply on the basis of his authority, not because it was written in scripture or stated by a revered teacher, but to examine it against their own experience, to test it in the laboratory of their own lives, and to accept only what they found to be genuinely true. This quality of inquiry, of honest self-examination, runs through the tradition from its very beginning. It is one of the reasons the teachings have remained, across 2,500 years, a living rather than merely a historical phenomenon. In his later years, according to tradition, the Buddha returned briefly to the Shakya kingdom, the place of his birth, the place of the palace and the gardens and the silk banners. He saw his father. He saw Yasodhara, his wife, and Rahula, his son. These meetings are described with quietness rather than drama. The life he had left was still there. The people he had loved were still real, and he had not, in leaving, stopped caring for any of it. He had simply come to understand it differently, to see it within a larger frame, one that included its impermanence, its suffering, and its beauty, all at once. The leaves that still move. The Bodhi tree still stands, or rather, a descendant of it does grown from a cutting taken from the original tree many centuries ago, now rooted in the same soil at Bodh Gaya, still spreading its branches over the place where, according to tradition, a man once sat through a long night and opened into understanding. People still come to sit beneath it. They come from every part of the world, carrying different languages, different histories, different depths of familiarity with the teaching. Some come as dedicated practitioners. Some come as curious travelers. Some come in grief or confusion, or a quiet and unnameable longing that they cannot quite explain. They sit beneath the tree, and the leaves move gently above them, and the sounds of the world continue. And something in the quality of that place, in the long memory of it, seems to invite a particular kind of stillness. The story of Siddhartha Gautama is not, in the end, a story about a special or superhuman being who existed in a category beyond ordinary human experience. Early Buddhist tradition understood the Buddha as a human being, one who had taken the questions that all human beings carry and followed them further and more honestly than most of us manage to do. What he found at the end of that following was understood to be not his alone, but potentially available to any being willing to look with genuine honesty and genuine patience. This is perhaps the most quietly radical thing about the teaching. Not that it offers consolation, or promise of protection from suffering, or assurance of a particular kind of afterlife, but that it suggests gently, clearly, without drama, that the nature of the mind can be understood, that suffering has causes and those causes can be examined, that the grip of habit and reactivity and confusion can be loosened, and that something resembling genuine freedom is possible for a human life in this life through the patient and honest practice of attention. The questions Siddhartha carried out of the palace on that dark night so many centuries ago are not historical questions. They are not questions that belong only to ancient India or to one culture or to one tradition. They are the questions that arise in any human life that is lived with enough honesty to look at what is actually happening in the mind, in the body, in the relationships, and the ordinary days that make up a human existence. Why does it hurt? Where does the hurt come from? Is there another way? The Deer Park teaching has ended. The long years of walking and teaching have come to their close. And yet, in another sense, none of it has ended. The tradition that grew from those early conversations in the forests and deer parks of ancient India has spread across the world in many forms, many languages, many interpretations. It has been practiced in monasteries and in homes, in meditation halls and in hospitals by ordained monastics and by ordinary people living ordinary lives. And beneath all of it, beneath the diversity of form and practice and culture and interpretation, the same quiet invitation remains. The same one that the man beneath the tree discovered in the long night before the dawn. Simply look, simply attend, simply notice with as much honesty and as much gentleness as you can manage what is actually here. The Bodhi tree's leaves move in whatever air is passing through. The river nearby continues its ancient movement toward the sea. The light changes, as light always does, from moment to moment, never quite the same light twice. And somewhere, in every age, someone is sitting very still and beginning very quietly to pay attention. This has been First Beliefs. Thank you for walking slowly with us tonight through this ancient garden. Until next time, rest well.